Strengthen your understanding of governance and policy design. The 12-week graduate course in public policy begins 10th January 2026. Apply by 30th November 2025 to avail a 10% early bird scholarship.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to All Things Policy, folks. We recently heard the news that Trump wants to allow NVIDIA to sell GPUs to China again. And we thought this is the perfect time to record a podcast and take an overview of the whole situation. In the studio, I have Shobhankita Reddy with me. She's a research analyst with the High-Tech Geopolitics program. I am Ashwin Prasad. I am also a research analyst with the High-Tech Geopolitics program. And this is a very fascinating topic that we were chatting offline about and thought we can turn it into a podcast. So the overall story is this, that we have been hearing different versions of export controls on chips for a few years now, and they have become more AI specific in recent years. And that is the reason GPUs have specifically been targeted and controlled in terms of exports to China. The fear was that AI is an emergent and a very consequential technology, and if China enjoys all of the capabilities that the hardware brings, then it can also catch up to the US in terms of what the use cases will produce. So then they found that chips are the perfect point to control this diffusion, because it's hard to control software than is to control hardware, and chips became the de facto way of controlling AI. And this has been a story that has gone on for a while now. We have had multiple versions of these export controls. It started much early, sometime last decade, but it solidified under the Biden administration with a very AI-focused export control framework for chips, which was then repealed, and then we've had talks of on-chip controls, and it's been a whole journey. So to give our listeners a very brief overview of what AI chips mean, you can think of AI chips as any chip that is specialized to run AI operations, and how specialized it is defines what it is. So even a CPU on your computer can run AI. Machine learning tasks, but it would be much less efficient than, say, a GPU, which is slightly more optimized for AI tasks, but again is also kind of a general purpose chip. And then you have the extremely specialized chips like TPUs, which are also called ASICs, which have been designed and made purely to run specific AI workloads. GPUs have this happy balance where they are desirable for AI operations, but they also give users the freedom to do things their own way, and they have a great ecosystem that they come with. NVIDIA has the CUDA libraries, it has softwares, it has models of its own that can help you design and build data centers for your own use cases. So it is become the most popular way of running AI, and therefore also subject to export controls. Shobhankita, do you want to give our listeners a quick rundown of the events that have followed the repeal of the AI diffusion framework?
Yeah, thanks, Ashwin. I think much of what this is underpinned by is the US narrative on AI, which is, how they frame it is what they want to do is secure global leadership through rapid innovation, a pro-market approach with minimal regulation, and the use of AI to enhance national security. So that's how the US defines it as there's a stated aim of global leadership and a pro-innovation approach. And I think this approach of looking at technology as almost a zero-sum game, that if I share it with you, then perhaps you get better at it, and then we end up having to compete. So perhaps the approach that's better for me, and me at this point of time being the US, is if I am already ahead in this race, and I think this framing as a race is something that we see. If I'm already ahead in the race than you, then I'm going to try and curtail the technology transfer to you as much as possible to ensure that you're going to be further and further behind. But there is actually a reverse to that, which is if I curtail, then you are forced to look within and develop your own domestic R&D capabilities. And so how do I keep you just enough behind me, but also not necessarily on your own path to indigenization, right? So I think that's the tussle that the US has been sort of trying to navigate for a while now. And initially it was all about tech denial. And then it became about loosening some of these things. And then, we see, for example, this year, Trump deciding, for example, to sell H200s to China. And even then, that was a compromise because the best of the chips that NVIDIA has are the Blackwell chips. And at this point in time, there's no question that Blackwell should remain in the US and that shouldn't go to the Chinese. However, the compromise is, what if we sell a lower alternative kind of a chip? And that was H20 in the past, which the Chinese squarely rejected because Huawei by then already had domestic alternatives that were equally or as good as the H20s. So the Chinese rejected that. So it looks like now the H200s are being positioned as a compromise between the H20 and the Blackwell. And the key here is to continue the leadership for America, but at the same time having China dependent to some extent, so they're not necessarily looking inward and developing these capabilities themselves. So I think that's the tussle. But this year has been very, very exciting, especially in the AI world, right? We started with a little before 2025, late 2024 was the breakout of DeepSeek. And that made global news from China because I think that was the first time, in fact, that the US got up and most people in Silicon Valley got up and sort of figured for the first time that China was not necessarily 6 or 9 months away, but it was perhaps just 3 months away. And they were able to reverse engineer and do a lot of things that the American model makers had done in a way that was a lot more expensive. So this was the Chinese being able to come up with low cost, higher inference, better infrastructure and better model engineering and do it in a way that was open source, because if it wasn't open source, it wouldn't have made the kind of splash in the global developer base that DeepSeek did. And I think DeepSeek continues to script the news for open source coming out of China to this day. And it has had, folks in Silicon Valley think more deeply about what it means to be better adopted, the kind of costs that go into all of that. I think that was a paradigm shift. And actually ending the year this year, and I hope we don't have more exciting news in the next 2 weeks, but actually, we are sort of drawing a close to this year with this news by Trump stating that he intends and the administration intends to allow potentially the chip of H200s to China. So that's again another news of consequence, because it does seem to me, looking back, that there were several signs this year, especially with the H20s, and then China actually saying, no, we're not going to allow our domestic tech firms to import H20s. And in fact, the Chinese government had very strict mandates that they required of domestic tech firms. They had to actually write to explain why they needed imports of NVIDIA H20s and why local domestic alternatives may not do that job. So they required very strict things like that from their own domestic tech firms. And then now we wait and watch to see what their official policy on the H200s is going to be. But again, it's been very, very interesting. And I think in between around April, May, we also saw, or maybe from January, even from the lunar celebrations in China, we saw the rise of Jensen Huang, who otherwise was perhaps a lot more politically neutral in his own public persona and image. But we saw that changing. And what's impressive, I think, in a very perverse way to me, is this sole character who's able to sort of lobby and get changes in policy that actually suit his business interests, which is impressive. And maybe not enough Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, tech bros actually attempt this endeavor, but looks like at least with this administration, that persuasive attempts actually played out. And over the course of a year, we see a reversal of some of these policies, because we actually started this policy this year with actually export controls being more stringent. And then we see a reversal of that this year. So I think for me, the big picture is there were several signs this year, especially with the rare earth export controls that China reinstituted against the US, sort of as strategic endeavor against the chip controls that it was itself facing. We see, at least I see, that perhaps the peak of export controls is behind us. There are several signs to see that people might have caved, people might have realized that it's not as effective. And then there are also business interests, because there's a lot of the business that Chinese give the Americans. So, that. So, yeah, I think that's the big picture.
Yeah, and it's very interesting this time around because of how capable the H200s are. To put it into context, I think they are a lot more capable in terms of AI workloads than anything that China is able to probably make in-house at this moment in time. And it's worth remembering that China has been cut off from the TSMC manufacturing facilities. So it's not able to make semiconductor yields that are as efficient and as capable as what NVIDIA has access to. So there are very real reasons for China to be happy about its access to H200s, but also there are other long-term ramifications that it's going to try and think about. And what you said is it resonates with what I think as well, because this is such a weird mix of national interests as well as commercial interests at play. And there is a lot of overlap, but there's also a bit of places where it doesn't overlap. And you still need an industry, a private sector to scale these technologies to an extent where they are very powerful. AI is the best example. It is completely private. It's a private driven industry, and only private interests and private money and private investments and scale can make AI potent. And that's the argument that comes out of all the companies in the US as well, that the more capable AI models is equal to more chips, more infrastructure, bigger data centers, more energy. It's all scale, right? That is being contested to an extent, but still, even if you have to assume that scale is not that important, you still can't have countries be doing this as a state-driven effort. You still need private enterprise in the mix. And so if you're going to need private enterprise, then you need to get them on board and work with them, and maybe also respect some of their interests, especially in the case of NVIDIA, its interests as in terms of China as a market, and in terms of access to that market, how much can it sell and how much revenue can it generate, is a very big part of that grand bargain that states have to strike with their companies. And they seem to have found some balance here. There is talk of they are doing this in an interesting way. So NVIDIA will make these H200s. They will be fabricated in TSMC in Taiwan, as always. But then they're not going to be sold to China directly. They're instead going to be shipped back to the US. And at that point, there will be a tax incidence, and they will take maybe 25% of or whatever they have quoted as a charge that the government is going to extract out of this, so that they get something, and then it is then exported to China. And that's how they are figuring out this whole 25% charge. And that has all the signs of a deal being struck between NVIDIA and the US government. And yeah, like what makes it interesting is because H200s are so powerful and so potent. And so in the short term, China is going to be happy if it has access to this chip, simply because it can do more. But in the long term, they do have an interest in trying to build up their own capability and trying to not wean off their dependence on US for their chips. And Jensen Huang becoming much more vocal and his lobbying becoming much more overt is also interesting. And this goes on to show that none of these people at that position, when technology and geopolitics have become so intertwined, can they afford to just stay silent and stay out of it? They are forced to enter the public stage and drive narratives that suit their interests. And it's a game that they have to play. It's the nature of the world we live in today.
Yeah. So just to put some of this in context, right? Before the first round of US export controls on China, China accounted for 22% of NVIDIA's revenues. And as of fiscal year 2025, that number was down to 13%. So clearly this directly hits NVIDIA's interests and Jensen Huang's. Also, think of it from the Chinese perspective. If you were an official in the Chinese government today, would you want your companies to be buying these chips, 25% of which would then fund your primary adversary? Right? The fact that the US government takes a 25% cut of all revenues of these sales is again an interesting dilemma again for the Chinese, I can imagine. So I think that's the confusion that we are currently in. And there are, in terms of the voices coming out of China, I think right now there is no official statement, but they're likely to demand or encourage their domestic tech firms towards domestic alternatives, or requiring official permission and permits if they do want to import NVIDIA's alternatives, right? Like, why are Huawei's Ascend chips not enough? And they might have to write that in writing. They might have conditions attached to that, so on and so forth. For example, there was this news early this year that data centers that are funded through specific schemes in China would need to be specifically using Chinese chips alone and not necessarily American. So there are some of those things. In August this year, Chinese authorities summoned ByteDance and Tencent, questioning them about their NVIDIA purchases. So things like that, where you see, for example, that there's a focus on domestic chips. The Chinese state might actually believe that the H200s and Huawei's Ascend 910C are on parity. So use Huawei, who also, by the way, NVIDIA calls their most formidable competitor. And I think that's another interesting tangent in this conversation, where we consistently see Jensen Huang sort of prop up Chinese firms and Chinese AI capabilities to be much better than what actually they seem to be for the rest of us. And this has gone back all the way to this year, right? So, for example, early this year, he has said things like he told senior Chinese officials that NVIDIA would unswervingly serve the Chinese market. He emphasized that being locked out of China would be a tremendous loss for the company, and a tremendous loss, quote unquote, because those are his words. He has praised China's technological advancements in AI, reiterating, in fact, that China is not behind the US, and he has consistently called Huawei a formidable competitor. To the questions that US strategic community has asked, which is, are you going to be funding the Chinese PLA because, these chips are so important in so many weapon systems, he has retorted with the Chinese PLA doesn't need American chips because they have enough of those in-house that are very, very good. And in fact, this year we have seen how NVIDIA has expanded its workforce in China. They've opened, or at least announced plans to open an R&D center in Shanghai, things like that, right? So we see consistent efforts where at one end, he's appeasing to the Chinese market and at the same time personally lobbying with the Trump administration and constantly underplaying the risk that some of these, and this is not necessarily in the American interest, or we don't know how this might play out. Maybe this might just stabilize in a way that these chip wars become less and less significant and we move on to the competition between US and China in a completely different domain. But at this point in time, immediately it doesn't look like it's in the best interest of the US, and yet he's been able to ask for that change. And there have been, again, interesting things this year, right? Which was in July, for example, the Cyberspace Administration of China summoned NVIDIA's representatives about potentially the H20s having a kill switch, that they could be remotely disabled. And then there was actually a Reuters report that, this came in August, that US officials had been secretly putting some kind of tracking devices on these high-end chips. And in fact, if any diversion to China happened, it would actually notify the US officials. Now, it's not really clear what layer of hardware tech stack this was happening. We don't have too many details. But clearly, there is a lot of distrust about importing these chips, even on the Chinese side, which I think makes it even more interesting.
Yeah, and the whole export controls of the entire chips themselves seems to have become less in significance, and we are moving to a more nuanced way of control of these chips, especially these on-chip controls in terms of location tracking or kill switches, or the chip itself having at a fundamental layer controls that prevent it from being used at certain thresholds are all at play. And irrespective of whether they're being implemented or not, or which batch of these chips have been tested with any of this, these are hard questions to answer, but the narrative itself creates a very powerful it's a psychological effect on countries and in the way that they approach it. And I can understand that China would feel this a lot, and it is the main lever for them to create the sense of creative insecurity among their own companies and countrymen, right? And I think it works in their favor in the long term. They want this feeling to be there, and we have seen them gain paces in various technological areas using this creative insecurity, and that kind of plays out here as well.
Yeah, I have a different view on this. I think creative insecurity would play out positively for China in the short term, but I think in the long term, I mean, if you study China's rise as a technological powerhouse over the last many decades, it's benefited the most from a globalized world. And I think the Chinese know that very well when they, in their global governance initiative for AI, talk about an open, free world and so on and so forth. Right? Values that they don't themselves advocate domestically, but they seem to champion in the international arena. It gives me a sense that they understand this very well, that in fact, they've benefited from technology transfers, a free flow of capital, of talent, of ideas, of research, and they would want to keep that going. So I think in the long term, some of these tech denial regimes would actually hurt China's interests. In the short term, sure, you would see, renewed interest in science and tech. You would see mass mobilization of people and talent going into specific endeavors that the state would positively champion, which is, science and tech, and specifically deep science and tech. But I think in the long term, it may not necessarily benefit China. So I think that's the tussle again for them to play with.
That's interesting, and that I can see that playing out in different ways. So I have a question for you. So China is known for moving up the value chain in various technological domains, including trying to do so in AI and information technology, which also means that it has to let go of some of its entrenched advantages in the value chain that are below, like a slightly below the aspirational value chain that it wants to occupy. So the US also went through this phase, and what the US did was it outsourced things that are lower in the value chain to the rest of the world, and that was enjoyed. One of the countries that enjoyed the benefits of that the most was China. Now, if China also is advocating for an open and a globalized world, which can act as a market for its own products as well as a source of capital for its own ambitions, then it also means that it will have to let go some of the things further down the value chain to other countries. But we kind of see that not happening because they try and stop services and manufacturing from moving out of China and coming to India, for instance, or Vietnam, or so many other countries. So how will they do both? So they, on one hand, they want the benefits of a globalized world. On the other, they don't want others to enjoy the same benefits that they did a few decades ago.
Yeah. I think this is why, for example, Pranay has spoken about how China is a global market failure, because clearly it's not an equal player, and it doesn't necessarily act in good faith always, right? In fact, there was this recent news a month ago or so where they actually went to WTO against India because we weren't necessarily looking to import their EVs. And for China to do this is actually quite funny, right? Yeah. But I think what you mentioned is also in policy, by the way, from the Chinese end, because the recent 15th five-year plan that was tabled in China talks about how they would like to, have a major objective towards indigenization and, all of these new quality productive forces as they talk about it, which is AI, quantum, all of these high tech. But at the same time, they would want to maintain the same percentage of GDP to manufacturing as it was previously. So the same document which talks about AI, quantum, and so on talks about also steel, mining, construction, so on and so forth. So they don't want to let go. And I think they're quite insecure about some of the efforts to sort of reshape global supply chains away from China. So I think it's both, and it's a top-down thing. It seems to be encoded in their policy as well.
It's a unique combination of both confidence and a lack of confidence in what the country can do going forward.
They want to do everything.
Yeah. That is, we have been traditionally used to seeing a very confident US, at least in the last parts of the 20th century. But now that we're in the 20th century and there's a wave of deglobalization, we see a less confident US, and we see shades of that in Chinese behavior as well. And that's an interesting trend to follow as we go along. So now we are ending the year with this bold prediction that the export controls, or the peak of it, is behind us. So what do we see happening next year? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, if this is true that this is how things are playing out, and this is how tech wars between US and China, although I think war is a metaphor that we shouldn't use very lightly, because the minute you say something is a war, the idea is to then mobilize everything towards that at the risk of so many others, which might not be the kind of opportunity cost you want to pay. But regardless, playing into what people seem to call this, if this is at least the tapering of the tech war as it pertains to AI, I think this may be good news for India, because typically we have been sort of at the receiving end of a 1-2 punch from both the US and China, right? At one end, Biden's AI diffusion rules put us in category 2. When China instituted their reverse rare earth export controls, automatically India was one of those countries that couldn't get them very, very easily. So I think we were in between both of these tensions playing out, and that doesn't necessarily serve our own national interest. So, I mean, I don't know if I'm speculating too much, but on the outset, if this is true, this sounds like a good news for us in India in the short term.
Yeah, we are no longer going to be the unintended consequence of two great powers trying to disadvantage each other in terms of technology access. So it's definitely in India's interests to see a globalized tech ecosystem so that we can absorb a lot of the positive offshoots. Thanks, Shobhankita. This has been a fascinating conversation, and we should do a follow-up next year to see if we were right or wrong about some of these trends, but it's still a very interesting story to follow.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for sitting down with me. And I think some of this has been speculative, and some of this has also tried to make sense of so many disjointed news that came out this year. But hopefully, we have a follow-up on this to see how this plays out.
Yeah. Thanks to our listeners. We'll catch you at the next one.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.